All right. Hello all. Well, we could continue talking a little bit about the ISSS presentation from Saturday or any other pieces. Look at some Wolfram and codes. Um, there's a few other pieces to possibly explore. But anything, Randall or George, you want to bring up or look at?
I can't think of anything right offhand. My mind has recently just been focused on this JST SIG, getting it organized.
Cool. Um, Randall?
Yeah, so well, I think last time there was a little bit of discussion veering into Peter's efforts with ASC. And so the conversation around PASC and discourse analysis was kind of intriguing. But, just kind of digging a little bit deeper, and I'm not sure we talked about this, but I think we've sort of bumped up against it in the past. It's sort of like there's a sort of a philosophical turn, um, either implied or implicit in this whole theme of active inference. So, I think one of the ways I'm starting to characterize that is, sort of the philosophy of the computational universe versus the mechanical universe. It's like everything is, it's almost like, oh, animism is true, sort of thing. Um, but that's a little bit of a, blunt force way of approaching it. Um, so I don't know, is that something that is of interest to, to develop this thread of conversation?
Yeah.
Yeah, and by the way, Wolf isn't like the first person who ever thought of this. Um, uh, Trying to remember the guy's name. He was a physicist back in the, I don't know,
Bohm?
50 years ago or so. Huh?
Bohm?
Boom.
Not Bohm. There was another one. I'll see if I can dig it up.
But oh wait, yeah, definitely we can explore this. I mean, I think the convergence of like the computational, the cognitive, and then the physical or material or manifest spaces, like those three seemingly from previous discourse were perceived to be different. It's like computation was seen as distinct from cognition. And then those were kind of like nebulously or contentiously linked to any material substrate, leading to all the kinds of like debates and isolated positions that we know. But now there's a different setting where those are non-contradictory. And then in terms of like you mentioned philosophical turns, I mean, this is what came to mind was this book where Friston's an editor and writes, I think, one or two of the chapters. Um, with the pragmatic turn and action kind of summarizing the broader embedded, enacted, et cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera, et cetera. It's just people you can
Yeah, yeah,
add as
yeah.
many adjectives as you want, but what is it actually gonna collapse back down to is just like the actual active embedding of the system. And
Yeah,
then
but
and yeah,
there's a dimensionality there that um, can easily get glossed over. And it's sort of like our experience and our reflection on the world. There's a huge, there's a lot of stuff there. Um, and so it's kind of important not to alienate your audience. Like, these are the words we use, and how do we come to that? There's I think there's a shortcut way to get to that. It's like, oh, just pragmatically, all that stuff doesn't matter. Just set up a sensor system and set your computer to process the data, versus help people understand, be relatable. There's another sort of, there's another layer of discourse there. I'm not sure I'm making sense, but
I think so. I mean, it's a
yeah.
very important point, and it just reminds me that the apologetics and the conversion path and the external communication is not the internal discourse necessarily. Like, internally, there doesn't need to be this continued justification of why embodiment. Like, to enter into the space is to take that as a starting point for an embodied system. So as we continue to explore that, developing the actual kernel of what these ideas are before rushing to tell people about what's still a work in progress and just bring hundreds of people into a construction site. And on the other hand, you could have a completed building, but then if there's a moat around it, then no one's there either. So about like understanding the right timelines and ways, like, and then also some of these things that required decades of cognitive science work, most people were never convinced to the contrary. So there's a lot of ideas that are super long-lived and durable in the academic discourse, but if somebody was never exposed to that discourse, I don't think it would even be relevant to bring that idea up, only to like convince them and then rug pull them and tell them that it wasn't that way. Here's how. It's because they're already on the other side of the hill with all these basic features. So I think that's kind of like what Bucky Fuller and Synergetics does, is it's written in the first principles way of like, go stack four spheres next to each other. What shape are they? It's a tetrahedron. That's what close packing means, not trying to only justify it to somebody who's already in the XYZ world. Because if you develop all the educational material converting people from the XYZ world, then it's self-defeating, because as that world dries up, that material that you constructed becomes outdated and there's no true intrinsic discourse. You just have all these kind of like baits for people to come from other places.
Oops. Not sure what happened there.
It was the video. Funny, the video is frozen for a second, but I hear you.
Yeah. Yeah. So, this is kind of like one of the problems of system science, right? Relative to, what you might call conventional science. Popperian versus, falsifiable versus statistical, approaches, and throw in some network theory.
Yes,
So
definitely.
there's still a lot of people who haven't read those books.
Like, in the philosophy of science side, I mean, the movement from
Yeah.
positivism, we're discovering things, falsification, we're negating things, towards the Bayesian epistemology, where just things have probabilities. Many people, they don't know about the positivist falsificationist dialectic. Now, through many decades of public education, falsification has come into the discourse in certain ways. Like, people will
Mhm.
commonly, say, oh, well, science doesn't prove, it disproves. but then they'll flip around and the next sentence is science shows this, or they just prove this does that. But I think this just like we surface and create new abductive accounts, and then we evaluate accounts and we evaluate new evidence in light of all the accounts that we have, like the abductive reasoning, Bayesian epistemology. I think it's the closest to how um people work, unless they've
Mhm.
specifically learned about positivism and falsification.
Yeah, so I'm not sure where it's going with all that, but just thinking is like, how does this all figure into, the educational um, needs and
Yeah,
of a community?
yeah. I think, I mean, it's a big question. It just makes me think about like there's the perhaps later in life education and the kind of contemporary triage type education that picks up wherever somebody actually is and then connects it with systems. But that's not necessarily how the internal voice of systems education would be. It wouldn't
Hmm.
need to continually make external reference and contrast and people thought this, but actually we think differently. It could just
Mm.
be stated clearly and positively, and there isn't a need to do all this kind of like contextualizing and contrasting system science versus like some unnamed other approach.
Hmm. Well, yeah, so yeah, you could make an argument that um, for critical discourse, right? Is that
Critical meaning like what?
well, is that sort of a purely uh, you know, falsificationist Hegelian, paradigm, or is there something within active inference that, so I'm thinking like adversary, generative adversarial systems, right? And evolution, right? In the larger context we find ourselves in, there is this, there is always this sort of back and forth going on, and back and forth. I think is very, that's a sort of very simplistic metaphor for the complexity of evolution. But is there a place for that in the um, levels, maybe levels of active inference? How do I'm just trying to think through this whole, what are the implications of this way of thinking, and this way of doing things. Um, there's all kinds of considerations, just pragmatically, because in practice you run into people and they have different they have different opinions, different perspectives.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like I'm sure critical discourse can mean a ton of different things, like ranging from just sort of bringing up critiques and then that playing into that Hegelian engine, like problem reaction synthesis or however it's framed. And then there's like the more broader theoretical critical discourse. So that in the active inference terms, that just makes me think about how when we're communicating, if we're in a semantically aligned reference frame, then communication just it's like fastball down the middle. Like, what do you want at the meat counter? Up 2 pounds of this. Okay, here it is, done. But the critical discourse, I think, calls rightful attention, though not complete. It's not the complete approach, but to the fact that we also differ in the reference frames. So
Mhm.
like even just in the last days, I'll see someone talking about an app and they'll talk about it as like the mother app. and think, well, that's invoking like a whole set of things around like, well, does the mother provide care or leave? Because there's insects that do it one way, there's insects that do it another way. It's like, oh, come on, you know what I mean? It's like this. It's like, well, no, I don't know what you mean. And then that ends up revealing a lot of the implicit reference frame alignment components of communication. But if we're going to be talking to even within what's understood as like homogeneous groups, then still there's going to be differences in the reference frame. So those are challenging settings to formally model, but at the same time, I think we can get far even with some fun language simulations.
Yeah, so those concepts are, are really quite useful, and sort of returning back to like the past, conversation about past is like, maybe there's already a lot of material there that could be not necessarily a recast, but reflected back into the, the active inference dialogue.
Here's working with, so Perplexity AI using Claude 3 language model, working in the Wolfram language, which I know Dave's worked a lot on, and then over in the Wolfram cloud, made a new notebook, just pasted the code just right now. Okay, active inference, critical theory, run it all. So there's some syntax errors, but sometimes it's just like a pasting error. Like it's not a true syntax error. It just because I just pasted a whole code block in. Like if you just separate this into blocks. It's just very interesting. Like it almost like goes so fast to past the limits of what we could write out or formalize that it almost like calls into question what formalization does. And you only have to, it's like kind of like knowing continents. Like I've never been to Australia, I know it's out there though. So it's like write a Australian novel in this language, another language I don't speak. But even just knowing that those areas of the semantic space exist, that's all the pointers that you need to just morph in and out. I mean, here we're still only in the text and code setting. We're not even going in and out of videos and other things like that, or spatial components. And sometimes, yeah, it's not correct, but I mean, really it moves so fast that I think it necessitates like taking a step back sometimes. Because like laterally in conversation, like we'll often bring up like, wouldn't it be cool? What if someone did this? But now just like that, what if? But then it's like, what if it were like that and we already had the code? Then would we develop the code into this or that, or what? So that leads to some very, very deep speculative trajectories that don't even have to be enacted. And then also the refinement of some of these trajectories that do deserve to be enacted.
That's an interesting question. And, and that, you know, that what do human beings reserve for themselves here, right? Um, those words do deserve, those are value judgments. And so it's like, yeah, and I think that's kind of what we're all puzzling about. It's like, what do you do with this? It's almost like, oh yeah, okay, so what? You got a mess of code, and um, and yeah, I'm not derogating it. I'm just saying that yeah, there it is. What what does it mean? This is there's a whole sense making thing that um, you're going to get different viewpoints on.
And then it's like, okay, we get multiple viewpoints on it. Then what with our single viewpoint on the multiple viewpoints? But I mean, like one of my favorite prompts is just writing the PhD dissertation as a table where the rows are chapters and then the columns could be like sections of the paper or contributions or perspectives. There's no you can just copy a column or a row and then say now write this as a 200-page dissertation, but this is the version that you would want to bullet point it back down to anyway. So then this is the most semantically crystal form to work with because it's so good at tables. And then you can say, okay, now pivot on the rows and go into a third dimension. And then using Coda or other tools, now you have the multi-dimensional table. One reason I'm thinking a lot about this, two days ago, I made a open source package based upon the work of largely Kirby Earner, aka 4D Solutions. So I don't know how much we've gone into the synergetics and the tetrahedral geometries and so on, but it's like for years in the Bucky Fuller community, we've talked about how do we facilitate the conversion and the mapping, like where a given setting could be mapped in the XYZ coordinate system or in the tetrahedral geometry. And then using a lot of the scripts that Kirby wrote, bringing them into Cursor, and then just using AI code editing in the loop. I made a new open source package, but I could barely even write out, like, if I didn't have access to the internet, I'd barely be able to write out the syntax of like a for loop in Python. I would just be guessing. But these are far, far more sophisticated scripts. I mean, invoking like the computational structures and things like that I don't even know about. Synthesizing multiple viewpoints, examining one's own positionality and biases. These are I don't again know very much, but this is a lot like critical discourse. But it's just one row in this table. But we all know about that row in the table. So then what happens after you say, oh, like I'm talking about, cell B2. or this is where the pattern languages for cognitive systems come into play. It's like, I think that's coming from a position of privilege, or I think that's a blind spot. But it only has to be raised once if it's going to be happening in an environment where it changes what is said, changes what happens. But if it's something where you can't intervene, it's like a movie, then you can just yell as much as you want, but then the movie's not going to change. But if it's interactive discourse, then just bringing something up is all that's needed at the moment. That's kind of like trim tab.
Well, it kind of feels to me like there's a germ of a theory there in of some sort, you know. Write it once and therefore you're done. I, there's a positionality inherent in that. Um,
What about, what do you mean, like, and you're done?
uh, well, it seems like there's, I don't know, there's an implicit assumption that, once this computational system returns an answer, that's the answer, right? Um, but it's totally decontextualized.
Decontextualized from what?
From the meat space of a human mind.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah,
Like, my
which is all
experience,
an entirely other metabolic flow, um, which my fear would be that the system somehow, with this Uber system, whatever it is, also has access to. And there you find yourself as a piece of meat in the matrix, right? And that, there's an identity thing there. And it just puts, any human being, any sentient human being on their upside down into a vat. It's, it's like, yeah, what are you doing?
yeah. George?
Yeah.
I'm afraid you've lost me completely. I've been trying to track this conversation and I have no idea what you guys are talking about. Sorry, I just had to offer that.
I think it's some of the experiential components of using like relatively advanced language models or synthetic intelligence. What actually needs to, like, what is our role in that flow? Would you say that, Randall, or what?
Uh, I'm just trying to make sense of it, on one level. I understand, that, we have this computational capability. Um, And, it's quite powerful, in terms of how it's able to simulate fairly accurately and robustly um, the kinds of things that phenomenally happen in discourse, say. And you've got a tool that can I'm calling it a tool. It's probably something, I'm not sure that's the quite the right word for it. Maybe it's a weapon. Um, and that kind of depends on how you use it. And these things exist. They do what they do. And human beings can have conversations about them. That's a different level of system that we haven't necessarily encountered before. And on top of that, the proposition of active inference is such that, certain kinds of molecular systems seem to do, or biomolecular or systems seem to do active inference as well. So you can simulate those and, robustly and precisely and so on and so forth. So this is something new. It's novel.
Yeah, like it's funny, like it will be funny to think and look back upon because we're so in the middle of it. But like we may see a doubling rate of lines of code or amount of generated text, like a doubling rate. There are still rapid doublings ahead of us, pending, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of knowledge engineering has been about like indexing, categorizing, annotating, searching, retrieving existing material. But all of a sudden, we've just been dropped into a space where it's like, there is no existing material. We're just like kind of like swatting in the dark with some pretty augmented tools. So these are things you can't search for, but you can push out and you can interpolate in. And then like this, I mean, this mobilizes like what George wrote about system science vastly. Yet it also relies upon what was actually created in a number of ways. Hmm. Another interesting component is like what Dave has looked at with a kind of logic of command and the logics of different conversation acts. And then how what these language models are doing is string continuation, most likely path of continued continuation. So path of least action, active inference. And yet the breakthrough was the instruct model that enabled the response to not just continue asking a similar question, but to give what is understood as a response. So you say like, even in like GPT-1 and 2 era, you would ask it like, what year did the moon landing happen? And then it would continue like, what year did this other event happen? Because it was just generating similar things. But now it's actually answering the things. And then, but that was achieved through statistical methods, not through anything other than that. And this just makes the pace, like it's hard to get into the Goldilocks zone because
Yes.
the pace, it's like, this is so much. It's like if we were to have a conversation, what would be some fun physical exercises that would help teach active inference? Like we've talked about this for years. And so it's like people come up with some and, something someone tried, something heard about, and it's like happening at like a pace, hanging out, we're just hanging and talking. But now, okay, now we have 17 critiquable starting points. And then so it's like very hot and then very cold, freezing people out, and then it burns you with how intense it is.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of uh, just it kind of be this philosophical observation of Alfred North Whitehead about misplaced concreteness just sort of like gets riveted into my brain here. It's like, if you're going to use something like this, you better well as hell have a good sense of what what you're doing. You know, it's like, yeah, okay, you can strap a rocket onto your back, but the question is, are you going to be able to control it? And I just kind of get the sense that a lot of people just aren't prepared for that. So there is this whole question of like responsible application, not let alone responsible development, because the world is a leaky place. Um, so yeah, so it was just the other day there was a webinar put on by IEEE. I don't know if you caught it, but um, they've been for the past almost decade they've been trying to develop standards for AI and so on. It's this kind of advanced
Yeah,
technology.
Dave and I are actually both in the spatial web group. I don't know if that's the one that you're talking about, but those things come up in the IEEE spatial web.
Right.
Yeah, but go on.
Yep. So yeah, and forgive me if I'm sort of talking out of school here, but it just I just wonder, is like, where is that in this conversation? Is that
Where are what?
where is all that sort of standard development stuff in this conversation?
There's a lot of angles on it. I mean, simply with a transcript and a prompt, extract 274 possible standards out of this conversation. So it's like, just because even if, and to the extent that is a relevant idea of setting standards, as opposed to like meta standards or the kinds of platforms that we've worked on, even if setting standards were important, even if it were the most important thing for a group at a time, that wouldn't even mean that it would be what they would need to be talking about.
Mhm.
So that's a kind of like multi-level discourse environment that that's enabled by these tools. But a group may not want, a group may take a radically different approach, which is like, we're going to hammer it out with each other in a room with low technology, because the rate limiting step to our coordination is actually like our relationing, not the existence of some sort of numbered bullet point list. And then, I mean, as like just from just seeing the kinds of discourse online, like people are just using and just washing what little semantic novelties they had are just getting washed and laundered through these text models. So then you got AI statistical learning outputting and flooding the human attention space with these kind of standards. But is that what we're even looking for? Claude 3's context window is significantly longer. And so it writes significantly longer responses. And then like by just re-injecting reminders to be concise and give long responses, that's very powerful. And also running the local models on my laptops and so on, and just kind of grappling with the computational needs that even like one run requires. But like
One
when you
run of what?
like one run of Claude 3, for example. Like when I'll run it on a laptop, I'll be like, okay, it's not a new laptop, but it just took 3 minutes to output something way, way, way shorter, like potentially an order of magnitude shorter and smaller context window, like running an open source model locally. So it's like, is this like running 100 laptops to dispatch this query? I know it's not all simply about just energy use and everything, but there's so many aspects that the media is the message, and like the clean design, like, I don't know, it's just hard to reckon with sometimes, but there's many affordances to explore within it.
Mhm.
Like I remember the uh, something deliberative dialogue or something like that with Janos and others, perhaps, and Giannis. uh, And it was like a multi-week, was like super broad range of attention from people who really cared and were ready to help to just total fragmented attention. And then it outputted some, sorted lists, not markedly different from these. There's the unique value of the actual inclusion of people suggesting things and seeing them getting voted on and everything like that. Well, a little of a different education time, but any other thoughts, or what should we go towards in the coming weeks?
Well, I'm not sure where we want to go, but you know, getting Shanghai in here and um, Bruce McNaughton or whoever else was participating, I think would be a good idea.
Yeah, maybe we could as we veer towards June and the conference, like even if we do or don't submit something for the conference, I feel like we should have a we should like do some kind of preprint, or just we could even just download these pages and just to have an artifact and to kind of like checkpoint the work before we go into another phase. That could be kind of fun.
Did yeah, I agree. Did I ever send you that paper, the journal article that I did many years back on? Oh, wait a minute, maybe I've got it. Uh, yeah, here it is. It's called Teaching Systems Thinking to General Education Students. It was
I
in, huh?
I think we can you send it again and then I'll make sure. Oh, here it is.
Okay,
Teaching systems thinking to general education students 2018.
right.
Okay. Access through Stanford University. Not for many years, my friend. Not for many years.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't catch what
Oh
you
no,
said.
it's just funny that it's a ghost of a memory.
Oh,
But yes, I remember, and then we talked about this, and then we considered like how to be repurposed. You talked about computer science and students from outside of the computer sciences department.
right.
That was, yeah. Like, how about next week and continuing till June? So just those, basically just 2 months. So it's only 6 to 8 meetings total. Let's get some artifacts and checkpoints in place before the conference.
Agree.
Thank you for the image there, Dave. All right, cool. Thank you, fellows. Farewell.
Bye-bye.
Gentlemen. Bye.